All right, hey everyone. I hope your day is going well.
Yes, we are talking all about tropics. Of course, it's Tropical Tuesday.
Yep, it's my favorite day. I love talking about tropical meteorology.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of my biggest passions. So
Mm-hmm.
I love getting to share some things about tropical meteorology with all of y'all at home. And today we're talking a little bit. Yesterday we talked, or excuse me, last
Mm-hmm.
week we talked more about the structure and how they form.
Mm-hmm.
How tropical cyclones form. Remember, because they're not just hurricanes. Some parts of the world they're called willy willies, like down in Australia. Some places they're
Mm-hmm.
called typhoons. Today we're going to talk about more about the Atlantic, things that we know about, like hurricanes and tropical storms,
Right.
and we're going to talk about their impacts.
Yeah, and so if you have any questions or comments, make sure to comment below, and we'll do our best to answer the questions you may have. And of course, we may even have topic ideas for next week's Tropical Tuesday. But let's go ahead and dive into the Saffir-Simpson scale. So this is how we come up with our hurricane categories, right? It's based off wind speeds, and I know last Tuesday we talked about how this is the biggest difference between, or one of the biggest differences between a hurricane and also a smaller scale tornado. Tornadoes are often looked at with the aftermath, their damage, and then they come up with estimated wind speeds. However, we were talking about the hurricane and how they drop these radiosondes, these instruments within the hurricanes. Those radiosondes collect all the data, they get that wind speed, and so that's kind of in the now, and that's how they come up with hurricane categories.
Yeah, and I see we have a few people tuning in. Hello to Christy, hello Shelby, and hello Matthew. I hope you're all
Shelby
doing
is
well.
back. Hey Shelby, glad to have you here.
Hello to Hilda. I hope you're all doing great.
Yeah, from Converse, Texas. Very nice.
Yeah, and so again, just like what meteorologist Meagan Massey just said, those hurricane hunters fly through. They gather all that data, the drop signs that fall through the storm, and gather the wind speed, and then we know what the winds are. And then this is a little bit of kind of a backtrack from last week. Remember, a Category 1 hurricane has wind speeds of 74 to 95 miles per hour. And I want you to notice as we go up to Category 2, 3, 4, and 5, notice how what the damage is like. It becomes more extensive at a Category 2 wind speed. Category 3, devastating. Category 4 and 5 is catastrophic. Here's the thing. Depending on the impacts, extra impacts can be caused by the wind, and that could lead to catastrophic damage even if it's just a Category 3 or even if it's a Category 2, depending on where it's making landfall. We're going to be talking about some of those impacts today.
And one thing to notice, so here's a question that you can ask yourself. When does a storm system become a Category 1 hurricane? Well, the answer is if we have maximum surface winds sustained at 74 miles per hour or greater. So that's when it becomes a Category 1 hurricane. The second question you can take away from this graph is, when do we hit major hurricane status? Well, the answer is Category 3, and that's with devastating damage. Now, one big takeaway is, I know category strength is important along with wind speeds, but pay attention to major impacts. Hurricane season will begin June 1st. Not only can coastal communities be impacted, but also inland areas as well. We have to remember, we have the hill country, so we are a flood-prone area. Each storm has its own narrative, movement, direction, wind speeds, torrential rainfall. That's all different between each tropical system, whether it's a tropical storm or hurricane. It's just so important to pay attention to those impacts.
Yeah, and so let's talk a little bit more about that with our wind explainer. And we're going to actually look at different kinds of winds. We're going to look at weaker winds below hurricane status, and then we're going to go up to hurricane status style winds.
And by the way, Amy just commented that we have Morgan and Madison and Timberwood Park. Glad you guys could join us today. Go ahead and take it away. I just wanted to give a quick shout out there.
Cool. Welcome, guys. Well, small trees sway and large branches start to be put into a little bit more motion when we're talking about weaker wind speeds. We're really talking about 15 to 25 mile per hour winds there. Notice how things change, though, as the winds pick up speed. Notice how the water moves. That's going to be that storm surge that we talk about. We've talked about how storm surge can be an impact. This is water driven by the wind. So the wind will push the water up onto land, and you see how it's getting closer and closer to our little house there. By the time our wind speeds get towards 35
to
55 miles per hour. Whole
Mhm.
trees will sway. Cars could veer if you were out driving in this. Twigs and small branches could start to break. You see them breaking off the palm trees that we have down there.
So let's bump it up even more. So now we have 55-mile-per-hour wind speeds up to 75. And like I said, remember that one big question, we had to have wind speeds of 74 miles per hour or greater in order to be a Category 1 hurricane. So you are looking at up to Category 1 hurricane strength in this image.
Yeah, and you see that structure damage begins, which basically that means that we could have shingles flying off the roof of our house. Those little tiles that you see on the roof of homes, those are called shingles for those who may not be aware, and those could start to fly off the roofs of homes. We could have damage to the sides of homes.
So Jennifer wants to know, is that 2, 3, or 4 winds, question mark. So at this point, we're looking at tropical storm up to a low-end Category 1 hurricane strength.
Remember, Category 1 hurricane strength starts with 74 mile per hour sustained winds. And this brings us up to 75. So as we increase the wind speed more up to a stronger hurricane, let's say, when we get 75 to 95 mile per hour winds, widespread structure damage could start to begin, and we could have a lot of power outages. And notice where the water is now. Remember when the water was way back? Now it's pushed well up onto land. We have that storm surge that's impacting our little house, which storm surge can be one of the deadliest parts of a hurricane, very serious for coastal communities. It's one of the things that was most notable when we look back at Hurricane Katrina, which happened back in 2005, impacting the Mississippi Gulf Coast, as well as southeast Louisiana towards New Orleans.
So I think one big thing to point out here is not only wind a big threat, but also we're looking at storm surge. And you know, the strong and the high winds will bring that water inland, but it also depends on your coastline. Do you have a shallow coastline? Do you have a steep coastline? So you brought up the Mississippi Gulf Coast. They have more of a shallow coastline. So more of that water will easily move inland.
Yeah, so what she's talking about there is our little sea shelf that's on the back end here. So let's say we're talking about our little sea shelf. Let me go ahead and draw a little line right here. You see how this is more shallow? Imagine that this isn't this shallow though. Imagine that the ground actually does something more like this. That would be a steeper coastline, which would help to make not as severe of a storm surge. But when it's shallower, like my first line that I drew there, it could lead to bigger storm surge as more water could be pushed up onto land. So that's just kind of a brief explain on how storm surge can be worse for coastal communities with more shallow coastlines. So in other words, when I say shallow coastline, I'm saying that if you went down to the Mississippi Gulf Coast, you could walk way out and only be up knee deep in water. Like you're only in knee deep water. You could walk like 100 to 200 yards out in some spots and still just be in knee deep water. Compared to the Florida coast, if you went to Florida, it would get very deep very fast. So a little bit of a difference there.
Right. And I just want to point out, Sandra says, hi from Addison, who's 6.5 in Converse. Hey, Addison, glad you could join us. And then we also have Corbin and Gentry from New Braunfels. So hi, so glad that you guys could join us. And then Susan says, this is Matthew, and one place I never want to live is a beach house because hurricanes wipe out beach houses first. So I know the structure plays an important role, which also can bring that house value incredibly high, as you know, sometimes these houses along the coastline can withstand a major hurricane, right?
Yeah, sometimes they now have homes that can be built, Matthew, towards coastal communities that are built much stronger. Actually, the state of Florida redid their housing codes pretty much on how to build after Andrew, which was a long time ago in the 1990s. Hurricane Andrew moved through South Florida, hitting the Homestead community, which is just south of Miami, and it destroyed the whole community. And Florida started to change how homes needed to be built. After Katrina on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, everything got wiped out by the storm surge. Being from Mississippi, I saw what the coast looked like before, and then I saw what it looked like after. And I actually used to live on the Mississippi coast and post Katrina, after the storm had occurred. And you could tell how much stronger everything had to be built. Everyone, there were these new codes. Everyone had to build their homes much stronger and businesses much stronger after the storm.
So let's talk about something closer to home. Hurricane Ike in 2008. You know, it made landfall as a Category 2 hurricane near Galveston Island. And one thing it did, it was the top 10 for the costliest hurricanes in the United States, and it was actually due to storm surge. It brought 15 up to 20 feet of storm surge along the Texas coastline, which of course brought property damage to buildings, homes, cars, you name it. And so that's why it's so important to pay more attention to impacts. Because like I said, Hurricane Ike was only a Category 2 hurricane. You never want to focus on, oh, it's just a Cat 2. You know, I'm not going to evacuate. I'm not going to follow orders. It's so important to talk about like storm surge and high wind gusts and our, you know, torrential rains expected in the forecast, which likely so because most tropical systems, their size and their motion and their movement, that could really bring flooding to a coastal area.
Yeah, and another good point is the most damaging part of a storm is sometimes not right up against that center part of the storm. Tropical Storm Cindy, I think it was 2000 and oh my goodness, let me think, guys. I think it was 2016. I was working on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Tropical Storm Cindy made landfall. The center part of the storm made landfall in Lake Charles, Louisiana, hundreds of miles away from the Mississippi Gulf Coast. But the most serious impacts from that storm actually were felt on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, where we had a lot of tornadoes, a lot of water spouts, and even a little bit of flooding in some spots, because that's just happened to be where the stronger impacts were. So it's always important to check where the stronger impacts are expected to be felt within a storm. And the National Weather Service and National Hurricane Center will put out special watches and warnings ahead of a storm, so you know what to expect where you are.
Exactly. So let's go and continue with the wind speed. So we talked about how widespread structure damage and power outages are possible with wind speeds of 75 miles per hour up to 95 miles per hour. And so now we're starting to see wind gusts or maximum sustained winds of 95 miles per hour or greater. So this is when widespread to catastrophic damage and power outages are expected. So this is when you definitely want to pay attention to the impacts and when storm surge becomes a major issue.
Yeah, and you see that our little home there is now flown away due to the damaging winds that that 95 plus mile per hour winds can bring. And then you see our palm trees starting to really bend over there, and our flagpole really bent over, and you see how high up the water is. That water is so dangerous during a hurricane. Definitely something you want to look out for. And by the way, when it comes to where that stronger storm surge typically is, it depends on what part of the storm is making landfall where you are.
Right. So let's talk about tropical systems, hurricanes, tropical storms, and even tropical depressions here. So think about you have a counterclockwise tropical system. So think about a clock and the way the hands go. Well, it goes completely opposite in a tropical system, especially if you live north of the equator. So we are in the United States, we're in the northern hemisphere in our tropical systems. The winds around those systems move counterclockwise. Now, after that, think of cutting a tropical system in fourths. So you have a line going vertical, one horizontal, and then now you have different quadrants, these 4 different sections. So here's the question here. What do you think is the worst side of a hurricane?
Yeah. What do you think? The front right, the back left, the back right, or the front left? Which part do you think is the worst? And by the way, guys, don't think of this as northeast, northwest. If the storm was going this way, think of it like, oh, okay, then everything will be turned. It all happens with storm movement. Which direction is the storm traveling? Like if your car is going north, where you'd have your front right part of the car, where you'd have your front left, your back right, your back left. If the car is going west, well, then your front right is going to be over here or down here, and you know, the front left is down here, and just different different quadrants. Don't think of it as direction or north, south, east, and west. Think of it as which way is the storm moving.
So comment below. We want to know what your guess is. So you have front right, front left, and back right. Which kind of quadrant do you think is the worst side of the storm? And again, it all starts with storm movement, like Andrew was saying. So we're not paying attention to, the north direction or the south direction. So comment below, give us your guess, and who knows, maybe Bill will have it on his pop quiz. We always mention that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we always start with storm movement, but the answer here is actually the front right with maximum storm impact. We're talking about storm surge. Like I said, with that counterclockwise wind, you often get the winds pushing the water inland.
Yeah.
And of course, it depends on your coastline too. Is it a steep coastline or is it a shallow coastline? With a shallow coastline, you'll oftentimes get worse storm surge.
Yeah, you can also have really strong winds in that front right quadrant. Not necessarily always the worst, but that maximum storm impact is really what's going on in the front right. Now, in the front left, you can still have significant storm surge because the storm motion pushing everything forward, but it's not the worst of the storm surge. The worst of the storm surge is typically in that front right quadrant. And by the way, you're still having the strong winds and everything like that.
So, and Addison, your guess is right. You guessed front right, and that is correct. So that's when you have the maximum storm impact. Matthew thought that, what was it, front left? And then we have Andrea saying front left, and then Ainsley also thought front left. So we're actually looking at front right. That is the correct answer.
But guys, answering front left was a great answer too, because that is also a part of the storm that is very significant. So everyone really did give a good answer. The correct answer may be front right, but all good answers with commenting on it being the front part of the storm.
Exactly.
So great job, guys.
Yeah, definitely. So like I said, pay attention to the major impacts here. So we are looking at front right and front left as being the significant storm surge, the maximum winds. And also one thing to pay attention to are the outer bands of these tropical systems, because oftentimes when those outer bands move inland, you can get brief spin of tornadoes on those outer thunderstorms. And also you could get, pockets of blinding rain. You can have rainfall rates in excess of 6 inches per hour, or 6 inches, just, total accumulation. But you could also get higher rainfall rates as well.
Yeah, and by the way, meteorologist Meagan Massey was talking about some of those tornadoes that are possible. Those typically occur on the right side of the storm, and that's what we had with Cindy. When I was at the storm I was talking about just a moment ago, that where the maximum impacts were really felt on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Yeah,
so let's continue here. So let's look at the back right. So you're still looking at a significant impact, but it's not so much storm surge, it's more of wind speeds.
Yeah, wind speeds can be very strong here. Remember, I just talked about how the right side can have a lot of spin-up tornadoes. Well, that significant wind is one of the things that helps those spin-up tornadoes kind of occur. They're usually briefly short-lived, but that right side, remember, they're in the front right. Significant wind is still a thing in the back right. It may not be the strongest one, but it's still significant that we're experiencing in that back right part of the storm.
What would be a great idea is to maybe get some markers and also a pen or pencil and kind of draw this out. So you start with a hurricane, you draw that. Draw an arrow going from south to north on your paper. So that's knowing your direction. So draw an arrow of your storm movement and then chop that hurricane in 4 different quadrants. So you have 4 different sections here. And write front right, front left, and back right. And write these specific characteristics down, because this is so important to know really anywhere and everywhere people live.
Yeah. And then finally, we have the back left. It's typically weaker. Doesn't mean that it's not dangerous, though. Still very dangerous part of the storm, but it is typically the weaker, where we have the lower impacts is in the back left part of the system. But remember, that doesn't mean it's not dangerous.
Right. And always have a way of receiving weather alerts, especially if there's a storm moving into Texas or anywhere along the coastal areas. Make sure family and friends have a way of receiving weather alerts too, because I just think this is so important to know. I remember learning this in college a while ago and just always talking about the 4 different sections. So this is something really important to know. Anything you want to add on to this graphic here?
No, I think that covers it pretty well. Just guys, remember that front right can be really bad. And we're going to talk a little bit about how the impacts go along a coastline. So I often compare things to Hurricane Katrina because that was something that I had experienced. I didn't experience it on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. I experienced it further inland, but we're going to talk about those inland impacts as well. Now, Hurricane Katrina took this kind of a path. Let me go ahead and show y'all. Let me draw it out for you real quick. Hurricane Katrina came straight north just like this. And with that, we had major storm surge on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. It actually was the largest storm surge to ever hit the U.S., and it was only a Category 3 storm. We've had quite a few Category 5 storms hit the United States, but none of those storms had a storm surge as big as the Category 3 Hurricane Katrina when it hit the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Now, that storm surge was a big deal, not just for the Mississippi Gulf Coast, but also for our neighbors in New Orleans. So the wind speeds were coming around the storm. Remember, they go counterclockwise, so they were blowing wind through something called the Rigolets, which is right there it goes right into Lake Pontchartrain, which if we have anybody who's a little bit older watching, Lake Pontchartrain may be referred to as a lake, but it almost works a little more like a bay, right? Where there's a little bit of salt water coming in and out of there. And the water got pushed in, it had nowhere to go, and the levees broke on the Lake Pontchartrain side into New Orleans. But that's just a little bit of a quick lesson there on what Katrina did. But here's the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and here's some of the things that we would see for coastal areas that experience impacts from hurricanes.
And storm surge being the biggest one, you have damaging wind gusts. Remember, Category 1 hurricanes start with maximum surface wind sustained at 74 miles per hour or greater. So that's why damaging winds are a threat. You also have flooding, because you typically get widespread torrential rainfall, and also tornadoes, brief spin up tornadoes. We've seen many hurricanes and even tropical storms produce tornado watches along, both Mississippi, Alabama, and to even the Florida Panhandle there. So that included Mobile and to Destin, Florida, Biloxi, Mississippi, even New Orleans, Louisiana, those different areas. If we have a storm going, straight north impacting the coast, one of the biggest things they have to watch out for are the tornadoes on the outer bands of those tropical systems.
Yeah, and something else people have to look out for is sometimes that storm surge will go up the rivers and creeks that lead out to the Gulf. And then you have more flooding up the rivers, and then you don't just have to worry about the water that's coming up the rivers, you have to worry about the water that's coming down, because inland areas can experience a little bit different impacts, but still can be pretty dangerous, like inland flooding. And then all that inland flooding has to go down into the rivers and down towards the Gulf. So inland flooding was actually a big issue during Hurricane Isaac, which occurred down on the Mississippi Gulf Coast as well, because it was a slow-moving storm. Flooding was huge for Harvey.
And I know we have some of you commenting saying you weren't born yet during Hurricane Katrina. Well, I could tell you that this is a major history lesson, because it is top 2 for one of the most costliest hurricanes in the United States. Actually, it's a tie between Katrina and Hurricane Harvey right here in Texas.
Yeah, Hurricane Harvey made landfall in Texas, and inland flooding was a major issue with Hurricane Harvey.
Right. So let's talk about those inland areas as well, because not only do tropical systems impact coastal areas, for those who live inland, you have to pay attention to. You can also get the flooding threat, the damaging wind threat, and also the tornadic weather too, the tornadoes.
Yeah, and during Hurricane Katrina, just another comparison back to Hurricane Katrina, guys. This was a while back, but The storm had Category 1 wind speeds well off to the north. I actually was living further off to the north than what this map is showing, but we still had damaging winds in our area, and we lost power and everything, and there were a lot of trees that snapped. We lived in the central part of the state. So here we are all the way up into an area called Rankin County, near Jackson here, and I want to show you how far away from the coast we were, but we had Category 1 hurricane winds. It was still a strong Category 1 hurricane too at that. So there you have it. It was about 143, really about 150 miles from the coast, but still we had damaging winds, we had flooding, and we had tornadoes. So that lets you know this damage, these inland impacts can occur well inland from where a tropical system makes landfall on the coast.
So this is a big history lesson here. So again, the top 2 costliest hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina and also Hurricane Harvey. And you know, Hurricane Harvey, some of you were born then. I know we have some 9-year-olds joining us. So we're talking about Hurricane Harvey. And that, of course, was a few years ago. And so again, one of the costliest hurricanes. And we like to talk about how each storm has its own narrative. And that's why we often say don't pay attention to categories too much, because it all depends on storm motion, the track, the movement with these. So for example, Hurricane Harvey, of course, had a different track than Hurricane Katrina. You were just talking about Katrina taking a northerly track, whereas Hurricane Harvey was actually sandwiched in between 2 areas of high pressure. So it didn't go anywhere. It just sat over Houston and dumped so much rain. And some areas picked up, 60 inches, maybe even more in some areas.
Yeah, and it was more of a flooding threat with Harvey. But Katrina had a much higher storm surge. Harvey was a stronger storm at landfall. But Katrina had a much stronger storm surge, and it was a weaker storm at landfall. And it has to do with where it made landfall. The Texas coastline does not have as shallow of a coast. You can't necessarily walk out 200 yards and only be knee deep in water. It all depends on topography. That's a big word there. And where you are.
Yeah.
You have to understand. It's always good to ask your friends and family if you ever move somewhere new. Hey, what are the impacts here if a hurricane makes landfall? Know what to expect. That's important.
Right. So let's talk about hurricane season, when it starts. Well, the answer is June 1st. So remember, hurricane season will begin on June 1st. A little bit of a lag in our graphics here. There we go. And then you see kind of this upward hill type shape with this graph. That's actually peak hurricane season, which is right around September 10th. So that's when hurricanes and tropical systems are most likely to occur. And then it kind of dwindles down after September 10th, and the season actually doesn't end until after Thanksgiving, November 30th.
Yeah, and you know, here's a throwback here to last week. What is the main thing that hurricanes need to form? What's that fuel? We talked about it last week. What causes hurricanes to form? I will give you a hint. It has to do with summertime and a little bit more sunlight, and it gives something a little bit more oomph to be able to cause more hurricanes to form. And it's the reason why we have hurricane season occur from June 1st through peaking there at September 10th, and then things start to quiet down by November 30th.
We talked about this last Tuesday. Think of a hurricane or a tropical system as an engine, like your car.
Yeah.
Well, a car needs gas to run. And so what is that gasoline to make that hurricane continue to go and continue to strengthen?
Yeah, we're going to be looking for y'all's answers.
Matthew says warm water.
You got it. It is warm water. Great job, Matthew.
Yeah.
Yep, warm water is the fuel to make these storms stronger, and that water really warms up from June 1st all the way through September 10th as that sunlight is higher, the sun is higher in the sky over the northern hemisphere, shining that light down onto the water, and that water warms up. So that's what causes our hurricane season to be more intense from June 1st to September 10th.
Right. And so the National Hurricane Center, they haven't officially released their research or what they're predicting as far as this year's 2020 hurricane season. But Colorado State University, correct? They released their research, and they're actually predicting an above average hurricane season. And I know Weather Chief Bill Taylor's been talking about it, but a few things that they've looked at here was the lack of an El Nino and above average, so warmer than normal sea surface temperatures over the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, so yeah, there's that more important thing, that sea surface temperatures.
The warm water.
Yeah, the warmer water. And we're going to be talking a lot about El Nino and what that is.
Yeah, El Nino and La Nina. So when you're thinking of El Nino, think of fewer hurricanes. La Nina, the complete opposite. You're looking at more hurricanes. So,
and that means more hurricanes for us, by the way. I mean, less hurricanes for us with El Nino, because this is actually something that it's cycles that the world goes through. The whole world, as weather systems go through, sometimes patterns will start to occur in the world, and we can find out if we're in an El Nino pattern or a La Nina pattern. There's actually all sorts of different names for these depending on where you are in the world, and it can lead to different kinds of weather impacts, not just for the oceans, but also for land.
Yeah, so we were talking about El Nino, meaning fewer hurricanes for us in the continental United States. So that includes Texas. Well, the reason is because of stronger vertical wind shear. So we actually talked about this last week on Tropical Tuesday, wind shear. Hurricanes and tropical systems, they hate strong vertical wind shear. So when I say vertical, I mean you're going high into our atmosphere and the winds get stronger. So as the winds get stronger, the higher you go up into the atmosphere, it just rips that tropical, storm and that system apart.
Yeah, it can cause the storm to lean. Hurricanes want to be straight up and down. That's why you see straight through the eye. They spin like a top. I mentioned last week, imagine you had strong winds. It's like if you were spinning a top, you want it to spin as long as it can. You don't want anything to happen to it. But if you thump it with your finger, then it's going to get kind of all wacky and just fall apart. That thump is like vertical wind shear for these hurricanes.
Yeah, definitely. So it's the complete opposite when it comes to La Nina, which means more hurricanes for us in the U.S. So you have not so strong, you have weaker vertical wind shear.
Yeah,
so hurricanes can kind of stand up a little bit straighter. They don't have that tilt.
Yeah, and so that kind of lets you know, oh, so that's how that works there.
And so that's kind of what Colorado State University was looking at. They were showing, a neutral ENSO or weak La Nina phase for the summer into the fall seasons of this year, hence why they are forecasting or predicting an above average hurricane season. I know Paula, she had commented saying Hurricane Katrina, my cousin from Houston came to stay with me. Hurricane Harvey, my cousin stayed and waited it out in Houston. We thought it would come close here to San Antonio. Yeah, and I think parts of San Antonio, we weren't here yet, but definitely saw some rain in this viewing area, especially over eastern counties. And, I used to work in the Waco market, Waco, Temple, Killeen, and some of our southeastern counties, like Milam County, received over 17 inches of rainfall from Hurricane Harvey. So just crazy rainfall totals there. And then Jennifer says, my mean dad turned off this, so I missed some. Oh, that's
don't worry. You'll be able to rewind it.
Yeah.
Here in a moment after we're all wrapped up here. This is still going to be on our Facebook page, and you'll still be able to rewind it and watch it again. So don't worry.
And if you want to review anything we've talked about, you can always rewind it, go back and take some notes if you want to. Yeah,
and speaking of wrapping things up here, I think we're about to wrap things up.
Yeah.
And these special weather mind segments, our classrooms, Cloudy with a Chance of Learning, continue tomorrow.
Yeah, we'll be posting an article on our KINS 5 website as well. So at kins5.com, we'll talk all about hurricanes there, and even include some history, talk about Hurricane Ike and why it was one of the costliest hurricanes in the United States. We'll bring up Hurricane Harvey as well. We'll post these graphics to our website just to kind of help you out and post some notes out there. Have a way of receiving weather alerts, especially if you know anyone that live along the coastlines of Texas into Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, so on and so forth. But anything else you want to add?
I just want to let y'all know these next few weeks for Tropical Tuesdays, we're going to talk about the hurricane hunters. Who are they? What do they do? We're going to talk about La Nina and El Nino a little more. We're also going to talk about some of the worst storms to ever hit Texas and the U.S. as a whole. So be sure to keep tuning in every Tuesday. Of course, we have the Weather Minds classroom every day at 1 p.m. Monday through Friday.
Yeah, so tomorrow it's on cloud types. So we'll be talking about different cloud types. And then Stacia, I'm excited to talk about insects and weather. So that's actually going to be her topic on Thursday. And then, of course, we have Fun Time Fridays where you share pictures of your notes, any stories that you have, Hurricane Harvey stories, Hurricane Ike, any hurricane stories that you may want to mention. Let Bill Taylor know. He'll be covering Friday along with Andrew. So just email them, awilson@kins5.com.
Yep, and then btaylor@kins5.com.
Yeah. So, all right, guys, we hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday. And yeah, we'll be publishing this article soon on kins5.com.
Yeah, and enjoy some fun times outside. But remember, keep doing that social distancing.